Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case may be in this bright, beautiful world we call home. It is Cross Examinations with Mike Miller. I am Mike Miller. I am not a theologian. I am not a master of divinity or any such thing. I'm just a guy who's been reading and studying the Bible for over 2 decades, and a comic book artist. Artist, writer, creator. But other than that, I am just here to give my thoughts and my, hopefully not my thoughts, hopefully the Lord may speak through me and answer some questions and help people come to a greater understanding, or just make people think a little deeper about what they might believe about the Bible, about faith, about reality. And so as you come in, please do like, please do share. Let's try to get a few more people in here before we start answering questions. I don't let me run through some of the questions from yesterday. As always, if you have questions and you're not watching this live, please do drop them in the comments section. Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. But drop your questions in the comments section, and I will try to get to them tomorrow if they seem interesting and applicable. So again, here, let's go ahead and see what people had to say. Oh, yes, yesterday we had Dirty Doug Tenaple on. He's not going to be on today. He's got a deadline, and he's got an inking show later. So Johnson says, I think Doug Tenaple undersold himself a little on his knowledge of Scripture and scriptural arguments. He knows, surprisingly, a lot about Scripture. I appreciate his appeal to ancient creeds and promoting the idea of studying good theology. Yes, yes, Doug is far better read than I am. It's like an interesting game to play. Stump Doug on have you read this book? And Doug always says, yep, I read that. Yep, I read that. Johnson again. I don't think the question about God making a square circle has anything to do with our limited perceptions. I think the point of the question is to ask if God can contradict himself. I believe the answer from Scripture is that God cannot contradict himself. He can't make a stone so big he can't lift it. I agree. I don't believe God can contradict himself. But my perception about making the square circle was not about contradiction or even logical fallacy. It was about a lack of human perception versus the eternal perception, the 2-dimension versus the 3-dimension, the 3-dimension versus the 10-dimension. You know, what we see through a glass darkly or dimly. We see, okay, first of all, the universe in and of itself. We are amoeba on a fleck of sand floating in the ocean, saying that, you know, proclaiming that we understand everything about the ocean. It's ridiculous just on a physical level. Add into that we are only perceiving 4 dimensions, height, length, width, and time, out of what science and the Bible through Nachmanides is an old rabbi from, I think, the 1400s, who discovered through an in-depth study of the book of Genesis that there are 10 dimensions. And then, 600 years later, through quantum physics and all that stuff, science also discovered that there are 10 dimensions. So science will eventually catch up to the Bible. Someday they may even agree out loud in public. But the point being that us saying God can't make a circle a square is it's not a logical contradiction. It is a perceivable contradiction. So from our perception, it's contradiction. From God's perception, it's simplicity itself. So that was my reasoning in my assertion yesterday. Why did WK asks a possible question? Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart after he had agreed to let the Hebrews go? This is the why did God question is always speculative. You can't, unless God tells you a specific reason for why he does something, then conjecturing about it is not really, I don't know, you don't have strong legs to stand on. And you don't know, people try to say, well, come up with an answer because this is the reason I refuse to believe in God. No, that if you have some particular issue with some particular action or some particular scripture out of a 1,600-page book with countless thousands of scriptures in it, then you're just looking for excuses not to believe. If you're a believer and you're wondering why, then yeah. Why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? His plan? I mean, there's God's permissive will. He allows Pharaoh's heart to be hardened. Heart to be hardened. Ooh, tongue twister. Yeah, honestly, I'll only have speculative answers for that, so I'm not gonna dig into that too much. My sketchbook suggests we call it iron sharpens iron. That would have been a good one, but I've already chosen what are the ones? Cross examinations. I liked that. I like the sound of it. So cross examinations, it is. Feel Sun Wheels. Satan in Job could be a good guy. He helped God learn a valuable lesson. He might not have been Lucifer. No, that's not possible, because God is omniscient. Therefore, God is incapable of learning anything. God knows the end from the beginning. He knows everything about the created universe because he created it. And he knows everything about eternity. Well, I would assume because he's God. He's omniscient. So Job didn't teach God anything. Job challenged God and failed. Not Job, but Satan in Job. And Satan failed at his challenge because God knew that Job, like I said, God knew everything. God is omniscient. God knew the end from the beginning. God knew that Job would not fail him, or would not curse him, and he did not. So you'd hope that Satan would have learned a valuable lesson, but I don't know. For some reason, it seems like that guy can't learn nothing. Bible Talk Live, Bible Talk. There's no promise to answer anything, more of a discussion. Yeah. To what extent, Wowzers94 asks, to what extent do you think the flood took place? Local or global? It seems to have been local to me. Great idea for a show. Global. It is a global flood. The Bible is very explicit that it is global. Does that match up with world history is the question. Well, if there are, I believe, over 300, I could be wrong, 2 or 300. I think it's over 300 global flood myths, legends, histories, however you want to call them, from disparate peoples around the globe, from Australia to China. Oh, you should read there's one, the Chinese one is from there's one from a group of people in China called the, forgot the name of the tribe, but if you read it, it is like so dead on to what the Bible teach. I mean, all the names are like in Chinese instead of in Hebrew, but very, very, very dead on to what the Bible shows. Gilgamesh, all over the globe, you have seeds or points of this story that are identical, right? An angry God wipes out a sinful world with a global flood and saves one righteous family on a giant boat. Okay. If you have that in history, see, in history, if you have one account of a story and then you have reason to question it, right? But if you have an account of a story from Greece, and then you have an account of the same story happening, but from Persia, right? Then you're like, oh, okay, we're pretty sure then that this is an actual historical account that happened, because if you got two disparate people, but then you think, well, it's possible that there were traders and they copied that story. But then if you're like, wow, we have this account in Greece and we have this account in Persia and we have this account in England, you're like, okay, that's pretty sure that is a legit historical event, because it's but then again, there was some point in time where you had traders crossing the sea from England. Okay, but you have Greece, you have Persia, you have England, and you have Australia. They all have. Okay, that is pretty much 100% sure that's a fact. The flood story, the global flood, God condemning the world, flooding the entire globe, one righteous family surviving through it, is in every corner of this earth, from peoples who have not had any contact with anyone who wrote Gilgamesh or the Bible or the Chinese version or anything. This, if historians had any lick of credibility, they would not doubt the global flood at all. But they have to, because it doesn't fall in line with their preconceptions. So let's see. Someone asked if did Job's wife even die in the story? I believe she did, but I'd have to. I want to move on to see what the new questions might be for today. So let's refresh this page, pop this open, push this button over here. Oh, there is ads. All right, scrolling back for more. Aloha, hello, 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 hello. Not likely even properly perceiving time. That's a good point. I'm buffering. May not get to watch this. If you have time, I have a question about your opinion of by scripture alone. Go ahead, Kim. There are accounts of the flood in hundreds of different ancient societies. Exactly, Chris. Do we have an account in Incan or Mayan? I don't know. Morge Zorge, why don't you check it out? DYOR. Once in a while, it's good to do your own research. That way, you can be sure that whoever is telling you what you're being told isn't biased. I am biased, but I came to my conclusions through what I hope to be objective research. Do you read the King James Version? I do. I love the King James Version. And I love it on the Bible app on my phone, because the guy who reads it is like this great voice actor. So, but yeah, I like the King James Version. I like the Old English. Plus, every Bible has its problems. Every translation has its problems, because Greek and Hebrew, Koine Greek especially, is the most thought-specific language ever devised by humankind, and it was in use for 300 years prior to the birth of Christ, and that is the language and the time that God chose to deliver his New Testament and translate the Hebrew scriptures into Koine Greek in the Septuagint. So we know through that language, it's just so much more thought specific than the English language or any other language that you're going to get in any translation today. But that being said, all translations have their problems, but the King James Version is 400 years old, so we know all the problems. Newer translations may have problems that they haven't caught up to yet, or they haven't caught yet. So, Doug says, I'm a Christian also, but some things are just God's business. Fair enough. Fair enough. Brandon Moore, Mike, look into this later. Have you ever seen Alfonso Rachel's ideas on Nephilim? It seems interesting. Deserves a conversation, hopefully, with him. Yeah, I love Nephilim stories and theories and whatnot. It's really fun stuff. It's probably one of the things that got me interested in the Bible. I'm trying to think if that's, yeah, with the Chuck Missler Nephilim, the take on UFOs in the Bible and whatnot. So that was one of the earliest things I was looking into when I started looking into the Bible. The issue or question I have is that the early Christians did not have the written scriptures, but there can be no doubt they were Christians. They didn't have the canonized scriptures, but as early as the earliest, well, they had the Old Testament, right? The earliest fragment of a scripture, I believe, is from the book of Mark, and it dates 77 AD. So that is within 41 years of the crucifixion. And it was written on both sides, which means it was book format, which means essentially it was published, which means that it was in circulation prior to 77. So they had, let's see, I don't know the exact date that they started penning the Gospels, but Paul started writing his epistles, and then his epistles would be copied and circulated. So the very, very earliest Christians, well, they were just Jews, right? The earliest Christians were Jews, and they had the scriptures and they taught Christ through the scriptures, because as Christ said, all of the scriptures speak of him, from Adam to, or not Adam, from Genesis to Malachi. All of the scriptures, all of the prophets and scriptures spoke of Christ. So they had scriptures they could teach from that. The New Testament scriptures were canonized in 314 AD, but they were all written within the lifespans of the first Christians. The last book of the Bible being Revelation, and written on Patmos by John in his exile, his imprisonment on Patmos. So yeah, the early Christians did have scriptures. They didn't necessarily have all of the New Testament scriptures because they were being written during that time. King James, best at least every printing error, flaw, and fully. No, yes, correct. Doug at 34. Thank you for that. Cam, again, at a minimum, I think that most could be said that Jesus intended to future state of by scripture alone. Oh, so let's scripture. I wonder if Jesus ever drank coffee. I bet you he did. Yeah, I mean, sola scriptura. If you see, the thing is that the early Christians were witnesses of Christ, right? When they were witnessing, they were, and Paul says this in his epistles, which were like 30 years, some of, when he said, I think it was like 30 years later when he wrote this particular epistle, he's like, if you don't believe us, ask around. A bunch of these people are still alive who saw Christ, who saw the resurrected Christ, right? He was imploring for the people reading his epistles at the time that you don't have to take this on my word. You're in flipping Jerusalem. You're in Israel. Ask around. Someone you'll talk to will have known that Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected. It was like not a big secret. So yeah, sola scriptura didn't have to become a thing until the canonization was closed, because you didn't need sola scriptura when you could walk around and be like, hey man, do you remember Jesus? Yeah, man, that dude came back from the dead. You know, it's like, you know, it would be like if Christ didn't exist. It would be like trying to convince people today that John Lennon rose from the dead, right? Like, ask around. It would be ridiculous, you know. It would be on the weekly world news, not being taught in synagogues and churches. I found the Nephilim's theory make the Bible make much more sense, says Chris Chambers. Absolutely true. Yeah, the Genesis 6 story of you know, the sons of God, which in all of Scripture always refers to a direct creation of God, which means an angel or Adam, right? Adam, Eve, well, Eve's not a son, but you know what I mean. Adam or angels are direct creations of God. Every descendant of Adam is referred to as a son of man, or yeah, as a son of man or a son of Adam. But a son of God, always a direct creation of God. And so, or Christ himself. But that's son positionally, not son as in a direct creation. And so, yeah, when it's talking about that the sons of man, or the sons of God, looked upon the daughters of man and found them beautiful and took them as wives and created offspring that were called the Nephilim, that were heroes of old, men of renown. I mean, just one dude marrying another daughter of man, it doesn't produce heroes, right? I mean, it does in the colloquial sense, but it doesn't in like some sort of a, every time you meet these two groups of people, it creates someone who's so beyond average that you refer to them as heroes of old and men of renown. So I think a lot of the old myths are actually based upon Nephilim, but we could probably go all day about that. True, they did have the Old Testament. Yes, they had Moses and the prophets, Cam. Thank you. Zebulon Pike, are you talking about dinosaurs again? Just got here. No, we're not talking about dinosaurs, but if you want to, let's go for it. P Money, if it wasn't for Comicsgate, I wouldn't know favorite creators like Doug, Critias, Mike, etc. were Christ followers. Cam again, so more accurately, would that be to say there was always a state of some scripture, but not all for early Christians? Well, I would say the scripture, I mean, put yourself, say it's 50 AD, right? You're a devout believer, whether you're Jewish or you know, Gentile, and so you're reading the Septuagint because you would, if you were a believer. That is your scripture, and that is the part you're studying. It's just like all you're doing is studying the sorry, I gotta stop paying attention to notices. The Old Testament. But then you also start getting the circulations of the Gospels, right? They're being published in your area. They're being published in your time. You might go to a synagogue and someone will read, Luke has just has just written down Paul's story, and it's now we're going to study this in church. So it's like, it's stuff, fresh new scriptures are coming in to your community from Paul over here, from John over here, from Mark, from, let's see, who else? I mean, just all the different, Paul wrote like half the New Testament. So, and how exciting is it? It's like, are you going to church this Sunday because there's a new epistle from Paul? I mean, it would be like so exciting to get. Can you imagine if like today it's like there's a new epistle from a true prophet? Well, it wouldn't be, but I mean, it would just be exciting. It's like new material is great. Like me sitting here waiting for the next Game of Thrones book to come out. It's like so. Anyways, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but not the same scriptures as Martin Luther, for example, Cam. Right, because you're in the middle of the publication stage, and then after that, you have the early church fathers, who, when they were writing, they would quote the epistles and they would quote the letters, they would quote the gospels, even though, again, they were not canonized. Somehow or another, they recognized the authenticity of those letters from the apostles, or for those who were writing for the apostles, like Luke wrote the apostles, or Luke wasn't a direct apostle of Christ, I don't believe. But he became a believer, and then like hung out with Paul and become a disciple of Paul, and wrote, obviously, the book of Luke, which is pretty much about Paul. I think. Again, not a Bible scholar. If I'm wrong about something, just hit me up. Might sound crazy. Chris Chambers, might sound crazy, but I'm pretty sure dinosaurs lied with man. We just used to call them dragons. I think you meant lived with man. The word dinosaur did not exist until the 1850s. You are 100% correct, Chris Chambers. Dinosaurs existed. We killed them off. There are a myriad tales, even in old newspapers from England, about how leather-winged flying serpents were killing sheep, and they were being hunted down and eviscerated. There are similar stories, I believe, from Babylon, or not Persia, somewhere, I can't remember. The most accurate description, again, that I've read comes from Marco Polo in the 1200s, where he describes to the T length, width, girth, attributes, size of the head, size of the forepaws, the size of the tail. He describes an Allosaurus, like down to the 3 claws on its short forearms, with like claws like a tiger, right? And then it goes on to describe how they hunt and kill them. And then it goes on to describe what they use all the different organs for in medicine, in delicacies. It's it's such a matter-of-fact reportage of a freaking dinosaur. It's, again, dragon. It's ridiculous. And so yeah, there's descriptions of dinosaurs in the Bible. There's the behemoth has a tail like a cedar tree. There's no other animal on Earth in the history of the planet Earth that has a tail like a cedar tree, except like the Brachiosaurus brontosaurus brand of dinosaur. So yeah, you're 100% correct. Anyone who yeah. Book of Job was earliest, says Doug 34. That is correct. Book of Job predates all of the other writings in Scripture. Dr. Fantastic says, hey. Remember also, young Jews studied scripture rigorously, like 6 to 8 hours per day. I'm going to get in something here. For people who question the, they say, oh, well, you can't, the scripture's not reliable because, you make one copy and then you make another copy and then you get all these errors creep in. It's like a game of telephone where after 10 generations, nobody knows what some blah, 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 blah. No. The Jews took the scriptures so seriously. The scribes had this process wherein it took about 6 months to copy one average length book of scripture, right? I don't mean the entire Pentateuch or the entire Tanakh. I mean one book, like the book of Genesis. 6 months to copy one book. And then what they would do was they would have your original copy, they would have your blank paper, right? They would take their quill and they would put the stylus on the letter they're copying, and they would copy that letter. They would move the stylus over, and they would copy that letter. They would move the stylus over, and they would copy that letter. Every time they came to the name of God, they would break the stylus and get a new one, and they would, I believe, they would also bathe ritually so that they could be clean before they wrote the name of God. And they put the stylus on the name, and they wrote the letter. Then they moved the stylus one over, and they wrote the letter. There was no, hey, what is that first line? In the beginning, God. Okay, in the beginning, God. Oops, I misspelled God. Okay, this was an extremely meticulous way to copy text. And like I said, it would take 6 months to copy one text. After they were done with that text, they would proofread it because they knew exactly how many letters were in each line. And so they had this system whereby they would count a certain number of letters, and if it wasn't the exact same letter, they would proofread this entire thing, right? And if there was one freaking error in this thing that took them 6 months to copy, they would burn it. That is why you can trust that from day one to today, the scriptures have remained intact. Sorry. Dr. Fantastic, coffee was from Central and South America. I thought that the Ottomans had coffee. Didn't the Ottoman have coffee? If the Ottomans had coffee, then they had to have gotten it from somewhere in Africa. I don't know. I'm just hoping that Jesus had coffee. I heard ice. Is Cecil here? No, that's me. Sorry. Raven Rouse. It's all moot. None of this is provable anyways. Well, depends on what you mean. Provable via scientific method? No, but nothing in history is provable via scientific method. You can't prove via scientific method that George Washington was president of the United States. There are historical proofs, and by historical proofs, Christ is very much provable. Doug says Jesus drank wine. Ethipia Hakafi. I bet he did. Zebulon Pike, wasn't Christ himself Jewish? Absolutely. Yes. King of the Jews. Born. I mean, that's the whole reason. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is a descendant of David and Solomon and well, actually, I don't know if he's the descendant. Oh yeah, he must be. He's in the royal lineage. But yeah, he's absolutely Jewish. Ethiopia. Doug, why did you say Ethiopia? All right. Cam says, I would agree that there were many witnesses. Yep. Rabid says, Jesus made wine. Optimus Deadpool, didn't Luke get his scriptures directly from Mary? His scriptures? No, Luke was kind of like, I mean, Luke was a physician, and he was kind of like the reporter. So, yeah, he probably would have gotten, because he got the genealogy of Mary, he probably got it directly from Mary or from the temple, because in that, see, back before the temple was destroyed, they maintained a genealogical record of every single person in basically every single Jew. Basically, they maintained a genealogical record because the land in Judea. This may get tedious, but the land in Judea was all subdivided by tribes and by like ownership of land could not leave the descendants of a tribe, right? Not permanently. Every 49 years, um, if you had leased out the land from another member of the tribe, say you're like a member of Dan, you're a descendant of Dan, and you wanted land from someone who was a descendant of Naphtali, then you could only lease that land until the year of Jubilee. And after the year of Jubilee, which is every 49 years, it had to return to descendants of Naphtali. So they maintained absolute records on the descendants of everybody in the temple, and it was destroyed in 66 AD. But it is what it is. Dr. Fantastic, I think Jesus was an amalgamation of previous mythological figures. Well, you'd have to make a case for that, and I don't think it would hold water. Cam, you seem to agree that early Christians did not rely on scripture alone. Well, like I said, if they couldn't, I think we're talking in circles here. Eric says, the interweb says coffee wasn't discovered until at the very earliest 850 AD in Ethiopia. Ah, coffee wasn't discovered by whom? Come on, don't tell me that. Son of Man is a title for God. Son of Man is a title for Jesus, Doug. David Rogers, Son of God is used on occasion as a title for kings. Usage in Psalms. Hit me up with one of those usages. Because in the Psalms, when he's talking about the Son of God, he is I shall call him son, and he shall call me father. He's referring to Jesus. That's a prophetical psalm about Jesus. Ooh, gosh, these questions keep coming. I can't do this all day, man. I got a lot of writing to do. All right, I'm gonna go. Yeah, hit that like button, people. Please go hit the like button. Where are the bones? Dr. Fantastic says, that's crazy, Mike. I don't know what he's talking about, but I'm sure it is. Dr. Fantastic, isn't it weird that a religion designed to make men meek and passive to authority was used to do just that? I don't know. Passive to authority. Well, so you're saying what, the state created Christianity? Because at the time, Caesar was the authority. In the Bible, even the authorities in the church are told to be servants to men. So we are all to serve one another. Yes, it does say to pay your taxes and to be obedient to the laws of the land as long as they do not contradict the laws of God. But I don't see where there's a problem there. It's not. I think what you're trying to get to is that it was some method by which the church would maintain authority over the people. But there is nothing like that in Scripture itself. That has been abused by churches, I will agree, historically, but Scripture itself does not teach that. So, unless you're trying to convince me that Rome had Jesus and the apostles create a religion that would make them meek under the authority of Rome, then you're swinging at the wrong ball there, buddy. Optimus Deadpool, you're asking, Doug, I have a question for you. As someone who was an atheist, how do you hate something that you don't believe exists? I always found that logic strange. True. I mean, if you didn't believe something existed, why would you waste a moment on it? I mean, unless you're writing fiction. Cam, Jesus himself referred to the Old Testament and often explained how what he was saying fit into that was the fulfillment of that. Absolutely, 100%. Zebulon Pike, I just want to say I really enjoy these conversations. Haven't been to church in years and believe these topics should not be off limits. Thank you, Zebulon. It is definitely not off limits here. If YouTube someday wants to shut down all the Christians, then sign up to my mailing list and I'll let you know where I land. Quoting the life of Brian. Chris Chambers. This is why there are stories of men becoming king for killing a local dragon, when we know for a fact that the king is a real person. Assuming he actually killed some large beast is fair. Yeah, even if you go back to the original telling of Beowulf, if you go back to the original telling of Beowulf, the Grendel is, I mean, think about how Beowulf kills the Grendel. He pulls off his arm and it bleeds to death, right? The Grendel is described very much like an Allosaurus or a T-Rex. If you go through and you read it, like the size of his jaw, its tail, stuff like that, Beowulf may have actually been a telling or maybe a mythologizing of just what you said, someone who became a leader because he managed to kill a dragon, a dinosaur. And, you know, T-Rex, if you're going to, I mean, if it's like some huge hulking thing, you'd have to be more than human to rip the arm off of a huge mythological creature. But you could just be a strong dude and rip the arm off a T-Rex. A T-Rex arm is like, you know, I don't think they're even like human big. They're probably smaller than, they're like kid arms, right? So if you ripped one of those off, and obviously it has arteries and whatnot, a T-Rex probably would bleed to death. So good point. Dr. Fantastic, that's complete and total fiction, Mike. That's a crocodile. I'm going to assume you're talking about what? The behemoth? You're joking, right? Yeah. It can drink up the river. Crocodiles. Dr. Fantastic, I believe crazy stuff too. I ain't mad at you. Oh, Cars in Depth says this isn't the past. Jewish scribes still work the same way. A friend and neighbor is a sofer, a Jewish scribe. It would seem, I mean, at this point, it would seem a little moot. I mean, I would get the idea of constantly testing to make sure there are no corruptions in what you're doing, but I think most Torahs today would be printed via computer and press. I'd be interested to know how that translates to modern times. But did the Catholics handle it with such care? The Catholics weren't the only one with the New Testament. The Catholics added some apocryphal books to the canon in order to maintain certain doctrines and dogmas that are unbiblical, like purgatory. But the words of the text themselves, they did not corrupt like some other cults have. You know, Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, have their own version where they change some of the words to fit their own dogma, their own heresies. But yeah, so the actual books themselves, yes, the Catholics maintained. Eastern Orthodox maintained. Subsequently, the Protestants maintained. So we still maintain the same. Although, granted, I think the Catholic Bibles were all translated from the Greek into Latin, and then they worked off the Latin, and then some of the later translations were translated from the Latin. So it's Greek, Latin, English, or whatever. But I do believe that the King James Bible was translated from the Hebrew and Greek. Trying to date back my memory here. But anyway, I don't need. Yes, you can trust the Bible we have today. Tug, hey there. How you doing, Tug? Tug's here. Hey there. Science is about observation. Science is based on something that cannot be seen. What? No. Nem Denamam says he is a descendant of David through the woman whose husband David murdered, Bathsheba. Yes. Yes. Doug, I'm a super right-wing nationalist, and those David Duke types disgust me. Yeah. Well, okay, I don't want to get into politics on this, but nationalism is a good thing. Nationalism is patriotism. And any president who was not a nationalist is a traitor, because as president, your job is to put your country first, which is the description of being a nationalist. You go to the dictionary, that's literally the description of what a nationalist is. So if you're not a nationalist and you're our president, you have the wrong job. Blue collar carpenter. Okay. What form do you think Christianity took 12,000 years ago? There was no Christianity 12,000 years ago. It's a bomb. Dr. Fantastic, thank you for considering my thoughts, Mike. You're a good man. Love you, brother. Love you, brother. I gotta wrap this up, guys. My kids are only gone for another couple hours, and I want to get some writing done. So I'm sorry if I can't get to all these. Gosh, there's a lot more questions, but I do need to go. Please do check out my Indiegogo, LONESTARcomic.com. Please do like this video, share it if you would, subscribe, and let your friends and family know, whoever you think could benefit from a little bit of cross-examination. Be good, be well, and love one another, and love God.